Hello and welcome to a new edition of True Audio Files. Today, get to talk about one of my favorite albums from the 90s, and that is Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill. Just came out as a one-step, so I wanted to do a sound quality shootout with this, and they made basically 4,000 of the one-steps. They basically cut this from a digital copy of the analog master tape. And I unfortunately don't have an original vinyl copy that I think was only available in Europe. I do have the original CD, so I have that. And then I think I have like a deluxe version that I think they did a remaster back in, I think, 2015. So I have that, and but what I wanted to really do a comparison with is I mean, initially, and I'll get into why I say initially, I wanted to do a sound quality shootout between that and basically the last vinyl issue of this, which was basically a Chris Bellman cut. It was also pressed at RTI, so it had good background in terms of the pressing plant and who did the mastering. And I also have, this is probably a little bit more, I guess, sort of kind of bragging more than anything, but I also have the Newberry Comics exclusive that was limited to 1,000. Basically is a multicolor marbled version of it. Basically the same mastering. It was done by Chris Bellman. I think it was still pressed at RTI, but basically same exact pressing as the other one I just showed you. So I don't know the lineage behind those, whether they were cut from the analog master tape directly or they were taken from a digital master, a digital copy. If I had to venture a guess, I would say digital copy, but if anyone knows any differently than that, let me know. So, like I do with all of these shootouts, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a brief description of how I go about doing these. So, the first thing I do is I kind of listen to the new reissue, in this case, the one step, all the way through, see what I think about it, try to find what I think would be the best song or songs to kind of do a sound quality comparison between. Then I do a level match to make sure that both records, in this case, and the two records that I have, are going to be playing at the same volume level, so there are no extra biases added to it. I actually had someone on my last video get into a discussion with me about how level matching really doesn't do anything and it really doesn't change any biases and it messes with the mastering, but anyway, it doesn't. If anything, it levels the playing field, so you're basically listening to everything at the same volume level, because if you do something at a different volume level, that one that's is louder is going to be perceived as better sounding, even if it isn't. So that's just kind of how the human brain works. That's why you see these masterings getting louder and louder and louder over the years. And once, digital came along and digital mastering came along, it took it to the nth degree and made it really bad. But I digress some. Anyways, I level match the records so I can do an A-B comparison between them to get a really good sense and a level playing field of what they're going to sound like. So I listened to the one step, and I thought it sounded really good. The one thing that struck me, well, a couple things that struck me. Number one is, I've listened to this album many times over the years because, like I said, it was one of my favorite albums of the 90s. And what it struck me is it definitely sounded different than what I remembered. It definitely didn't seem as bright. It definitely seemed a little bit more bass heavy, probably more like upper bass heavy, although on You Ought to Know, the bass drum was just remarkably deep, and how deep bass it was. It was remarkably deep, and it was amazing how deep it actually was. I actually felt it in the armrests of my chair. That's how deep the bass was on that. It was very impressive, and it really blew me away how monster sounding that deep bass was, and and I felt it more than I heard it. So that was the amazing thing. I definitely thought that the voice sounded nice and natural, though, and you know, there was still, or I shouldn't say still, there were a couple of cases of spots where there was some sibilance on it. But as I can talk a little bit more into that in detail later. The Chris Bellman cut definitely I was disappointed with initially because I thought it had a lot of sibilance, and this one definitely had some, but there was definitely less of it. And it wasn't as obvious either, I guess, is probably the more important issue. It was more of a situation where it was there, but it wasn't quite as in your face as it is on the Chris Bellman cut. So anyways, I digressed a little bit again, but anyway, so I thought, again, overall, I thought it sounded pretty good. So then I put on the Chris Bellman cut, and what my thought was initially on the one step definitely held true when I listened to the Chris Bellman cut. It was definitely brighter, definitely more high-end frequency, more upper mid-range frequencies, less kind of the mid-bass sound. But one thing that really struck me was it still had quite a bit of that bass that I heard on the one step. It was just, just wasn't quite as much of the kind of the mid-bass sound on the Chris Bellman in comparison to the one step, but it was still pretty bassy, and it was still pretty good. That deep bass was still pretty much there, maybe a little bit more so on the one step, though. I would say, imaging and soundstage were pretty nearly identical to me. I really couldn't notice much, if any, of a difference between the two. The one step was definitely a little bit quieter in terms of the pressing quality, and the surface noise on it was, a little bit less on it. So that was definitely very good. So, but I have to say, when it comes to both of them, I was overall I was not impressed or happy with either copy of them. And so what I decided then to do is I decided to play I ripped my original CD into a hard drive and listened to it through Roon that I have in my listening room, and tried to see what I thought about the CD version of it. And I have to say, the CD version, almost kind of felt a little bit in between the Chris Bellman and the MoFi, although the Chris Bellman was a lot closer to what the CD sounded like than the MoFi. Still a little bit bright, but I didn't have that sibilance issue, obviously, on the CD that I'd had on the records. And the other thing about it also was, it just seemed like there was more clarity. One thing that really stuck out to me when I did the kind of the comparison on the CD version is the hi-hats on You Ought to Know, which is in the right speaker, kind of somewhere kind of in the middle there, kind of in between the far right speaker, far right, and the center, kind of in the just barely off to the right. It was definitely more obvious and more noticeable on the CD in comparison to either the Chris Bellman cut or the one step. It was definitely a little bit more prevalent on the Chris Bellman cut, and I think a lot of that has to do with just the fact that there was more upper mid-range and high frequencies on the Bellman cut compared to the MoFi. I think what the MoFi did is it tried to tame some of that treble that I thought was too much on both the CD and the Chris Bellman, and it definitely made the voice and the vocals more natural sounding, but I think it took away from the cymbals on it to a certain extent as well. And I will say, though, right off the bat, that this is by no means an audiophile recording. So, it's not like they took this audiophile recording and they kind of put a veil over it or anything like that by, reducing the treble, because the cymbals don't sound good to begin with, but they just seemed to be a lot less existent on the one step, if that makes sense. So I guess if I had to choose between the two records, I would probably still lean a little bit more towards the one step, but not by a whole lot, just because the sibilance is tamed some, and it's not quite as bright. The vocals sound a little more natural, but I have to say that I think I prefer the CD. It's not very often that I say that, but in this particular case, I have to say that I definitely feel I like the CD better. Maybe it's because I'm used to the way that one sounds, but just to me, the cymbals didn't seem to get lost in the CD version of it compared to either the One Step or the Chris Bellman. And that, I think, is the biggest difference. And I think it was probably maybe a little bit more neutral sounding than the Bellman and the MoFi. The MoFi seems a little bit, warmer and not quite as neutral sounding as the CD, but the CD was still a little bit bright. So I guess that's my take. I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say and see if you've had any other versions that you've listened to that you feel sounded better than either of any of these copies. Maybe the original, vinyl sounded amazing, but I'm guessing it's probably very expensive, and I have no desire to go after that. So, but I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say. See if you felt that any other versions of the vinyl beat the ones that I listened to here, and if you think any of the other vinyl beat the original CD. Because I have to say, I think the original CD sounds the best, and I don't usually say that. I think anyone who's seen my shows here or videos knows that it's pretty rare that I will say that I preferred the digital or the, CD version, especially a CD version, which is got a limited frequency response in comparison. So, but I'd love to hear your take. What would you say? That's everything I have for this episode. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for subscribing if you subscribe. If you don't, please do so. Hit that like button if you liked what you saw here. And, if you want to make some comments, please feel free to do so in the comments section. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts. So thank you very much. I want you to have yourself a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week. Thanks a lot.